right, looks like we're getting to be a little bit more of a full room. So I'm just going to kick it off and get started. So I know we're going to want to make the most of all the time we have. So I want to start by telling you the reason we're doing this webinar. As many of you know, we kicked off a new fellowship. We're in our second year now, and it's called the Encore Public Voices Fellowship. That fellowship is designed to identify, support, and amplify thought leaders working at the intersection of aging, longevity, intergenerational connection, and social justice issues. What we've found in that community is that there is a lot of value to a shared space where people work on thought leadership together to amplify these ideas, to support one another, and to share learning, and to also get some formal training. Well, we couldn't accommodate more than 20 people each year in that cohort, and we decided to find some ways that we could support the multitudes of people who have shown interest in using their voice in the public conversation on these issues. So today is one of our first experiments in trying to support more people in thinking about how to elevate your thought leadership, whether you're new to writing and speaking and the other techniques we're going to talk about today, or whether you want to just up your game and get to the next level and be re-inspired. So I want to tell you how it's going to work. We're going to go through 14 different ways to up your thought leadership game. Each one we're going to do rather quickly. We're going to share some of our ideas and best practices, as well as some insider tips that we got from other members of the various leadership communities that we have here in the Encore and Gen to Gen world. And we're just really excited to do this. Then we're going to be opening it up to your questions for the last 15 minutes. And we're hoping you're going to stay on to the very end, because we want to do a survey to find out what else you would like us to have covered and other remaining questions that you have. So my interest in all of this is before I came to Encore, I was a journalist and I lived fully in the world of ideas and media. And it's actually how I learned about the Encore movement. I started writing about it because I learned of the thought leaders who are working on these issues. And I also coached and taught many others on how to use their voice in the public conversation. I still do much of that in my role here at Encore.org. And Sarah McKinney Gibson, my co-host for this webinar, is another thought leader in this space, and she leads a lot of our storytelling initiatives. And I want to hand the mic over now to Sarah to tell you a little bit about herself and why she's excited to speak to us today. Here you go, Sarah.
Thanks, Marci. Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be with you all today. So my background is about 9 years ago. As a first-time entrepreneur, I started writing articles, and I was super scrappy. I would often just be shy of stalking editors and writing completed pieces and reaching out to publications and getting published. And that strategy led me to being a regular contributor to Forbes, a guest contributor to Fast Company, a bunch of other publications. And I've continued to really enjoy writing. I started out as a super fan of Encore before I worked for the organization. And some of my early pieces actually were about Encore's work. And something I'll mention later on in this webinar as a tip is I would reach out to Marci as a friend who I knew had a lot of experience writing articles to look at my pieces, make suggestions and edits before I would send them off to the publisher. So it's now as a employee of Encore, I get to do so much storytelling. I really love that part of my work and lifting up storytellers and helping to inspire other people through the work that you all are doing.
Sarah, before you begin, I just want to say one other thing. Sarah and I are going to refer to a lot of resources throughout this webinar today. We promise you in a follow-up email, you're going to get a bunch of fun links that will provide you with stuff that will help you to take this stuff to the next level. We just have time to scratch the surface on a lot of these techniques, but we're going to send you some tips that will help you go deeper.
Definitely. Yeah, expect that probably sometime tomorrow.
Okay, it's up to you, Sarah.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to get out of my video here so you guys can see the full screen. Let's see there. Okay. So some people are already on Twitter probably, and others may just be interested in kind of using it in different ways. But I think the first thing to really think about when you're getting on Twitter for the first time is find somebody who is savvy with that platform and get them to mentor you. You're going to learn so much more from even an hour spent with somebody who's familiar with the platform to just get your profile created, start following some organizations and people that are interested in your issues. And then really for the first couple of weeks, feel comfortable just lurking, just watch what's happening there, see how other people are tweeting. Don't feel the pressure to start tweeting until you feel confident. And one thing that is a different way that you can tweet is if you're reading an article, finding a quote that is particularly inspiring to you just differentiates your tweet and makes people more interested in retweeting that message. So pulling the quote in addition to the link to the article, and then making sure to tag the writer and the publication is a great way to try and reach other people and get some increased visibility. And for those of us that attend a lot of events, a great way to kind of get active on Twitter is to live tweet, which just means that you're tweeting during the event what people say. So you're kind of typing quickly and then tagging the people on Twitter who are the speakers. And usually events will have a hashtag that they'll let you know about at the beginning of the event. And if you use that hashtag, it's incredible how people during the event will they'll search that hashtag to see what other people are tweeting. And that's a way to kind of build some awareness at the actual events. And then, if you're looking to kind of up your game on Twitter, making sure that you're being really strategic in how you're tagging organizations and individuals, that can help bring you increased visibility as well. And something we'll talk about a little bit later is just why Twitter is important if you're trying to do some writing to get your voice out there. Twitter's a little bit of a first step to get your voice out there. I'll pass it back to Marci.
Great. So the next technique we want to talk about has to do with using your voice at community meetings. So Sarah, can you just advance the slide? Great. I want to just give a shout out to Encore Public Voices fellow Brenda Atchison, who I have to say is just such a natural at doing this. She's really an example of, if you take on volunteer and leadership positions in your community, in civic organizations, in faith organizations, you just have a ready outlet to start using those positions to advance the ideas that you're passionate about. And it's a great way to practice seeing what it's like. Often you can get real-time feedback on the ideas that you bring up in a community meeting or setting. For someone like Brenda, her activism has led to a public access TV show that she does on African heritage cooking in Boston. She's a home share host with Nesterly, and her activism on that front has resulted in lots of ways for her to be a spokesperson on the issue of home sharing out in the world, and it's gotten her involved in local age-friendly initiatives all over the Boston area. So, these ideas here have so much to do with every other place you might use your voice. Do your homework, be knowledgeable, be generous, and make the connection between your personal passion and sometimes even your personal story and the civic opportunity or the kind of solutions-oriented way that your work and your ideas could be relevant to others in the community. So I'm gonna, on that note about stories, I'm gonna hand it over back to Sarah.
Thank you. Okay, I love the story of Connie. So Connie is an 89-year-old friend of mine, which is about 40 years my senior. And we met years ago, and I just adore her. And she is a volunteer with an organization in Los Angeles called Homeboy Industries, which is a gang rehabilitation nonprofit. And she works with a lot of young people. And she shared her story on Encore's blog. And it led to all these amazing opportunities. It was picked up by mainstream media. She started receiving awards. She's actually on page 26 of the Pope's new book, Sharing the Wisdom of Time, where she's talking about her volunteerism and she's giving advice to future generations. And I think the real lesson in Connie's story is that you just don't know where it's going to lead you when you're willing to share your story to help others. So be on the lookout for organizations and even blogs that you feel like are really small to share your story and just kind of see what happens from there. I think there's a little bit of magic at play when you do that type of thing. All right, Marci, I'm passing it back to you.
Hi. So we talk a lot about writing, and there's so many ways to publish your own writing without the need for a gatekeeper, meaning that you don't have to find an editor, you don't have to find a publication. So through blogging and newsletters and all kinds of new channels, we can really all be communicators on the issues we want to communicate around. So one idea that's really useful for it, whether you're thinking of yourself as an individual thinker and writer and speaker, or whether you're thinking about this from an organizational hat, is to consider starting a newsletter. I remember years ago when I was a freelance journalist trying to build my own brand, I was writing for the New York Times and many other publications, and I started a newsletter, and that newsletter was my way of controlling the story and sharing my work in the world and forming relationships with readers individually. So we think a lot about newsletters here at Encore. We have several different newsletters, and we've really started to pay a lot of attention to understand what's happening with our newsletters, who's opening them, who's reading them, the platforms available like MailChimp that are often quite reasonable, give you lots of data. So you could really understand who's reading, who's responding, who's clicking on the various links that you include in your newsletters. The newsletter platforms also can train you how to be better at newsletters. They all offer webinars and all kinds of learning tools. So if you're interested in a newsletter, I'd say the first couple of steps are collect names wherever you go. So if you're speaking or if you're going to an event and people give you their business card, that's a good way to start building up a list. If you do collect names, make sure to let people know that you're going to add them to your mailing list, and try to make the newsletter an extension of your own ideas and brand of the community that you want to foster. So if you're interested in storytelling, consider starting your newsletter with a personal story. And even though a newsletter feels like a one-way communication, keep in mind that people may write you back, and it's really important to respond to people who write to you, even if it lands in your kind of info ad inbox. You have a really important opportunity to engage there. So that's your kind of reader response operation. So I will hand this back over. Oh, actually, I'm going to stay on the next one. So so in the as we continue like the self-publishing category, I want to mention something that I've been doing a whole lot lately, which is publishing on LinkedIn or Medium. So even though I come from a background where I'm used to writing for a publication like the New York Times that has literally millions of readers, there are often moments where I want to get something out and I'm going to get it timely, and I do not want to wait to see if some gatekeeper is going to accept my submission. And the beauty today is that we can all be publishers on LinkedIn or Medium or many other platforms where you can just put up your posts and immediately get them out into the world. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand LinkedIn this year because I created a course on LinkedIn, and I just love it as a publishing platform. It's possible to tag people. It's possible to include a really nice image, to embed links, all the things that you would do in a traditional blog. And instantly, your entire network can see what you've written. You can also, on LinkedIn, immediately share your post by making a status update and then linking to your article. You can share your post on other platforms like Facebook or Twitter. As with any kind of writing, and I should have said this even in the newsletter context, and it really starts back with what Sarah said about getting a mentor for Twitter. I'm a huge believer in finding a second set of eyes, finding a person who will be your reader, and you can play that role for someone else, reading over not just for typos, but have you written as tightly as you wanted to write? How's the voice of your piece? We can always up our game in our writing, and it's good, even when you're self-publishing, it's important to find your own editor. And as you do things like self-publish on platforms like LinkedIn and Medium, you have to remember that it's not just writing the thing, you have to figure out how it's going to find readers. So you have to make sure to share with your network. One nice tip we do is you can include a link to your latest article in your email signature or in your social media platform. You can write an email to your friends asking them to share. And the best way to get people to share is to give them the language you want them to use when you're asking them to share a piece. So I'm going to now toss it back to Sarah for our next few techniques.
Yeah, I mean, what Marci just said is so true. You're reminding me, Marci, that when I would used to, track down editors and get published in new places, I would email everybody I knew and say, please share this and have suggested copy with the link. I was a little bit shameless about that, but it really helped to get the pieces out there. So I really think that is important, especially at the beginning, to do. So this piece here, I ended up being published by Fast Company. I wrote a piece about connecting the generations after going to an Encore conference. But the funny thing that happened here, and relates to one of my tips around being patient, is that I had emailed the editor at Fast Company and I didn't hear back after a week. And so I posted it to Medium. And then I heard back from them. And they said, we're going to publish an edited version of this piece at the following time. Please confirm exclusivity. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I took it off of, I told them what had happened and I took it down from Medium. And they said, it's fine to share there after, I think it was 2 weeks of it being exclusive to Fast Company. And it was a real thrill. And so what I would encourage you all to try and think of this as is I had to find the fun in this. So it's like, there's a lot of possibility and potential when you're reaching out, and most people are going to ignore you. I would say 8 out of 10 times I was completely ignored. I didn't hear back from anybody. And then after a week, I would just try the next person. I'm actually doing that right now for another piece I just wrote. So don't take it personally and just persist. And it is quite a thrill when somebody says yes. So try and find the fun in this experience and don't feel like, oh, they don't like me. It's really not about that. It's about, is your writing a fit for the audience? And following all their submission guidelines. Most places, and we'll follow up with Fast Company as an example, but most places will have their submission guidelines available. They'll provide you with the right email to send a piece. Not all publications will receive a written article, so that's the first thing that you want to look for. And if, sometimes you do have to track down editors' information if they don't have submission guidelines, and that's also all available online. So just be really scrappy and try and have fun with the process. This next piece is something that when March for Our Lives started happening, I reached out to an editor that I already had a relationship with, and I said, hey, I'm thinking about this idea. How this whole movement is, what are the people over 50, kind of what's their place in it? And I pitched him a story idea and he said, let me talk to my editor. And he actually came back to me with a different way of approaching the piece and said, if you can do it this way, then we'll publish it. And here's the timing associated with it. So I said yes, and I think that's really important, that if you are pitching a story idea, you've got to be flexible, that some people are not going to want that exact idea. There might be a variation on that that's going to work for them. So be flexible to that kind of feedback. And then it's really important to track down experts to interview, requesting a high resolution photo that you can use in your piece. This isn't a great example, actually, the screenshot, but we did get a great photo of the people, and they're included kind of as individual profiles later down in the piece. And always be really respectful of deadlines and receptive to edits that might come your way. All right, so I'm going to pass it back to Marci.
Great. We're staying on the kind of writing for publications themes, and I'm going to talk about 2 other ways that you could get your ideas in the pages or screens of various publications. So this one is about writing a letter to the editor, and then I'm going to talk about the related topic of writing an op-ed piece. So letters to the editor, interesting. And typically, letters to the editor are in response to something you've read in a publication. And I'm citing Encore Board Chair Paul Irving here because he's really a master of this. Paul just so quickly gets something out. Often a bunch of us will read something, there'll be a little email conversation about it, but Paul, rather than just doing that, he zips off a letter to the editor. Sometimes speed is the most important thing in getting a letter to the editor published. What editorial page editors are looking for when they publish letters to the editors are succinct, well thought out arguments with a point of view, either pro or con what was covered in a recent piece in that publication. And they want to get them out very quickly. So you usually only have, a day or two at most to get a letter to the editor in if you want to get a good chance of getting it picked. And so here's where I would argue for speed rather than perfection. And these days there's even, and you won't know if you don't get selected. So you submit your letter to the editor. All publications will have guidelines. So wherever you read the letters to the editor, you can usually find submission guidelines for where to direct your letters to the editor. They might even tell you how long they should be. But it's a good idea to study that section and see the other kinds of letters that have been published about how long they were, what kind of angles they usually, how they were written. And this is an area where often your title or your position may matter. So if you're affiliated, if you have more than one affiliation, for example, choose the affiliation that best supports the letter you want to have submitted. And another tip here is that in the days of online comments, I feel like in some publications, the letter to the editor has been replaced by a really robust comment thread, especially at places like the New York Times. So if you're going to bother to frame something up, to share it with your community on Facebook, why not also submit it to the publication as a comment in a comment thread or as a letter to the editor? It's just you've often written the very thing that you would submit in this format. So the next thing I wanted to mention, relatedly, is writing op-eds. So here at Encore, we're really interested in the idea of op-ed writing, and we constantly read the op-ed pages to see if ideas of asset framing around aging and intergenerational opportunity, like we're really interested in seeing, are those ideas with fresh angles showing up in the op-ed pages of major publications. So we've learned a lot from this from our partners at the Op-Ed Project, who we partner with on the Encore Public Voices Fellowship. And I've shared here some tips from Mick Smyer, who was an Encore Public Voices Fellow from last year. And this attached op-ed really captures what the essence of writing an op-ed is about. You really have to follow the news and jump on something that's really capturing the imagination of editors at the very moment you have your idea. So I think many of you may remember last year there was a very interesting moment where Dianne Feinstein was challenged by some young climate change activists. And it was the perfect window for Mick Smyer, who's the founder of Gray and Green, which is about bringing more older people in the conversation around climate change. He likes to say moving people from anxiety to action. So he used that news item as a hook for the idea of getting the generations working together in a productive way around climate change. And if you're going to write an op-ed, and this is an instance where you really have to write the whole thing and send it in and hope that it's picked up, you really have to answer these three questions. Why this idea? Why is it important now? And why are you the best person to be speaking about this? So that last why me could be because of your title and your job. It could be because of a personal experience that you've had in your life. It doesn't always have to be because of your professional identity. There's a particular format, and we're going to send you some good links from our partners at the Op-Ed Project on how to write a very strong op-ed. And this is another thing where everything that Sarah said about the waiting game and dealing with editors comes into play. It can be very, very hard to submit an op-ed, which you know is time sensitive because it's tied to the news and you don't hear immediately from the news outlet. In some instances, if you really want to get it published in a particular news outlet, you may choose to wait and give it, 5 days or a week. But in that time, your urgency may have passed. So you have to have a backup plan, which is what are you going to do if you don't hear back from the publication in time? And that's where you might want to publish it on your own blog, on LinkedIn, on Medium, or in some other outlet where you have a close relationship. So this is something that gets easier over time, and it's best to start start with smaller local publications and work your way up to national, more prestigious publications. And it's also, again, really important to make sure you've got a good reader challenging your ideas and helping you to write the best possible piece you could write.
Great. Yeah, I also think it's important to differentiate here between an op-ed and a featured article. So the slide talking about submitting a written article, how that's different is that an op-ed usually has a very strong opinion. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Marci, but I think that's kind of the difference between those two pieces. A featured piece may imply why you're interested based on your name and where you work at the bottom, but it isn't as opinionated as an op-ed, which is much more time sensitive and kind of taking a stance on something.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing, Sarah. That's entirely right. And I would say op-eds are usually really tied to something in the news or in the pop culture at that moment. So they're really timely.
Yeah. Okay, so this is such a great example. So Ray is a former Public Voices fellow. Is that right, Marci, from last year?
Last year.
Yeah. So he did such a great job of finding a local media outlet and really getting to know the entity and getting to know them in person. So he reached out to them, expressed his interest, and then got some FaceTime with the editor. They developed a relationship over time. He got to know some of the writers. When they would write an article, he would follow up via email and have a point of view in response to those articles. So he really built relationships over time. And what that led to was he had a quarterly piece. And he also kind of knew he said that the majority of the opinion pieces for this particular publication tended to be conservative white males. And so he knew he had a different perspective to offer. And he was really, really careful to understand the needs of that publication and the reader and live up to his commitment. So he said that while his piece was quarterly, he would always have it to the editor a full week in advance of that deadline so that there was time for feedback and edits and there wasn't pressure around that. So just really, don't overlook the local media and trying to see if there might be room for you to have a unique perspective there and try to build those relationships in real life.
Great. Great. So this is kind of an extension of the earlier technique we talked about being a voice in your local community or in civic organizations or even faith organizations that you belong to. So another great way to elevate your thought leadership and use your voice is to speak at a conference or another kind of event. And these days, I think these things happen as much in person as they do online. I've participated in virtual summits on various things, which is a little like the format we have today, which really takes some getting used to, but it's part of the world now. So if you're just breaking into this and you want to try to figure out how to speak at a conference or event, obviously people are not going to just find you and call you up. So how might you break in? So we brainstormed a lot with Karita Brown on our team, who is a master. She speaks at conferences all of the time. She had some wonderful tips to share and a few things to keep in mind. So if there's a particular conference you're interested in, first go to the website, see if there are calls for speakers or workshop leaders or panelists, and see if you're appropriate for any of those slots, and then pitch yourselves. You might also find that as you look at an agenda that's shaping up for a conference, maybe you know some of the organizations that already have a session on something that you're knowledgeable about. Maybe you can partner with an organization that has a prior relationship to the event, or a leader who you know that's going, who perhaps has a closer relationship than you do. So you can offer to co-lead. You could offer to even volunteer in a session to kind of get the lay of the land if you don't think you're ready yet. Similarly, you could develop a workshop that may fit one of the smaller time slot or smaller stages that are offered at a conference. A breakout session is another way to think about this. So the whole point again is think about the ladder of there's breakouts and workshops, there's facilitating, there's being a partner with someone, there's being a panelist, there's moderating a panelist, there's delivering a keynote. There's so many different kind of ways in. Some of them will feel more natural to you than others. I know that I love moderating panels and being on panels way more than I love delivering keynotes. And I try to find those opportunities, and I've kind of made it known to a lot of people that I work with that that's the way to think of me. You might find that you have some other skill that lends itself really well to what's needed for conferences. And so try to work with your strengths and with also what you love to do.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add too that a lot of the time, even leading a breakout session of an existing talk can be a way to either reduce or eliminate the fee associated with the event. So that could be another motivation to really contribute to the event as a way to reduce the cost to attend.
Yeah, that's a great idea, Sarah. So relatedly, there's a subspecies of the event, which is obviously we all know about TEDx events and TEDx convenings. And increasingly for, many of us who are out speaking and putting our ideas out in the world, a TEDx talk is a great way to do it. And I say TEDx both in the specific and in the more generic way, because really many other conferences and convenings have borrowed from the TEDx style, these like 12 or 18-minute talk. Sometimes they're as short as six-minute talks that are videotaped and then become, a piece of content that you can share and use to share your ideas out in the world. But if you're particularly interested in the TEDx world, go to the TED website, spend a lot of time trying to understand the TEDx opportunities in your issue area and in your geography. Are there any existing TEDx events that you feel like you'd like to participate in? Can you go to one before you submit a pitch for a talk? And if you're interested in submitting a pitch for a talk, we got some tips from Kevin Rabinovich, who's one of our new Encore Public Voices fellows. He started his own TEDx while he was an undergrad in college at Clemson University. He started a youth TEDx summit where he had high school students that he mentored in presenting as TEDx speakers. So I always go to Kevin for my advice on this. And he reminded me that presenters are often first-timers, so don't worry about having a lot of speaking experience. Just worry about, can you pitch your idea as a focused and well-honed idea that is not a broad topic, everything in the world, but is a particular angle about your topic. Think of a headline rather than a subject area. So, and again, this is all about practicing. You really, once you get a gig to be able to deliver one of these talks, it really takes a lot of preparation to pull it off. And anyone who has ever done one will tell you it's a pretty big commitment to stand up and speak without notes in this kind of environment, but it's pretty rewarding to do one.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add two things. I think authenticity is key for all of us who've watched TED Talks that we share with friends. I think that's an important ingredient. It's just really being willing to be vulnerable and put yourself out there. That also helps to differentiate the perspective. And then if there isn't a TEDx event in your area, you can create one. So look into that as well. If you're really interested in gathering people around a subject area in your community, that's something that you can do as well. Okay, so the next tip is self-publishing. This could be a book, or in our example, it's a white paper that David Shu wrote. It was called Untethered, a primer on social isolation. And it was beautiful. The content was incredibly, well thought out and valuable. And his tips are, I think, really strong ones. It's when you're self-publishing, you're not just the creator of the content, but you're also the distributor. So you have to know who your target audience is, and you have to be able to access them because you're going to be sending it to them once you're finished. He knew who his audience was. They were the first people he sent it to. And then from there it was shared. So that's a really important kind of first piece. He recommended investing and setting aside money for a designer. He said, well, a lot of people really appreciated the content of the white paper. A lot of people responded to how beautiful it was and how visually engaging it was. So that can make a huge difference in kind of standing out from the rest. And he said that publishing this white paper actually led to his first speaking request and several opportunities to be a freelance consultant. And so his advice was just to be really open to the relationships that come as a result of putting something out there. Similar to my example with Connie, you kind of do the legwork and you put something out there and then you don't know what's going to happen. So just being receptive to that. And I see a question here I'm just going to answer quickly. How do you define a white paper? It's really more of a research report, if that helps to clarify what I'm talking about. Versus a book, which is a different format. But a white paper is more academic, typically includes some research and is looking at things from that kind of more academic lens. I hope that answers that question. Okay, our last suggestion here is to start a podcast. And we tried to organize these in order of kind of barriers to entry. So easiest to maybe most complicated. And there are so many amazing podcasts out there. And probably not surprisingly, there's a lot of courses on how to create a podcast. So try and track one down. We reached out to Andy Levine, who started a podcast called Second Act Stories that we really enjoy, and he does such a great job. It's a good one to listen to, actually, if you're kind of looking for of a well-done podcast that's relatively new to the market. Similar to other things we've talked about already, just being really clear about what's unique about your podcast, being very focused, investing in the right equipment so it's professional. And then something he said that I thought was such a great idea is that he actually created several episodes and then he sent them to select people privately to ask for feedback. So he didn't share publicly right out of the gate. He actually built in some time to kind of refine what he was doing before it was publicly available. And once you're ready to make a public launch, just researching all of the platforms where people are listening to podcasts and making sure that your podcast is available there is important as well. Okay, I think we're going to go back. Marci and I are going to start our videos again, and we'd love to take some questions. I think Marci's going to look at the chat and pick some that are standing out.
Yes, I have some already, but I just want to add something to what you just said, Sarah, about podcasts that I was reminded of. We met Andy Levine because he reached out when he had started his podcast, and he knew that Encore would be a good relationship for him to have. And he just wrote us cold and he said, I'm starting this podcast. It seems up your alley. I know that you collect a lot of stories about second acts, and we're wondering, he was wondering if he could partner with us in any way. And we actually did develop a robust storytelling relationship with Andy, and he wrote to us cold. So I think that's just such a lesson about trying to figure out, as you're going through any of these things, who can help you in your network. It's really no need to go it alone in any of these endeavors. I also want to point out that many of the people whose tips we've shared are on this call. So in the final moments that we have, feel free in the chat back, if you are one of those people, let's say Mick Smyer, and we've just been sharing your tips, and there's something you want to say, please chat us. And I think we could either get you off mute or share what you have to say with the rest of the group, and Duncan will help us figure out how to do that. So here's one question. Sarah, you're a good person to answer this one. How could you differentiate between a blog post or a blog and a newsletter?
Sure. So a newsletter is something that you are going to use a software to create the content within that software, so MailChimp or something like that. And then you're going to email people the content of whatever it is that you're writing. Whereas a blog is something that you publish on a website and you're going to create the content there and then share that link to drive people to the blog. Does that answer that question?
I think so. I mean, the way we use newsletters, often we create a newsletter in some of our formats that's actually a collection of recent blog posts we have run. So that's another common way that there's a relationship often between a blog or blog posts and a newsletter.
Mm-hmm. Marci, I love this question about being quoted in an article. Do you want to take that one? Because I feel like you're often quoted in articles.
Sure.
And how can you be quoted, basically, increase your chances of being quoted in an article?
Yeah, that's a great question. So So I think there's two ways of this. There's the kind of ways you could set yourself up to be thought of as an expert and people will find you, but you can also take some proactive steps to help yourself get quoted. So any of the techniques we've talked about today are ways to get on the radar of media people who are looking for experts. If you become active on social media, even if that just means sharing interesting things that you're reading and seeing out in the world, but also sharing the things you're learning from the work that you do. You should start following the media people who cover the areas that where people are writing about things. So Sarah, you're a great example of this. Every time Sarah reads a new article by a reporter or a freelancer that she's never encountered, she always sends a note to the rest of us on the comms team and saying, I'm now following this person. We all start following that person on Twitter. We pay attention to what they're writing about. We often share it or comment on it or write to them openly. You could do that now on Twitter or on other social media. And it's a good way for media people to start being aware of your work. When I wrote a regular column for the New York Times, one of the people I got to know was Mark Friedman. Mark was an active commenter on my blog. He responded often to things that I wrote. And eventually, because I wrote about him when his book came out, he made himself available to me as a resource. And what I loved about it is Mark didn't care if I quoted him. He was willing to stay on the phone and educate me about something that he's an expert in. And he knew that sometime down the road, I would probably come back to him when I needed to quote an expert. But journalists often need to be educated on something, and they're not going to be beholden to quoting you just because you educated them. So it's important to think of relationships with media people and journalists as something that you cultivate over a long period of time, not just as a one-hit relationship in a transactional way. And the best relationships are the ones where a journalist or a media person knows they can come to you over time and learn something. Maybe talk on background means they're not going to quote you or attribute anything that was said to you, but they're learning about something. I've seen many people in our network do this so beautifully. Doug Dixon did this when there was a new reporter in Boston, Rob Weissman, who started a column on baby boomers. Doug brought that reporter to my attention so that I would know about him. Now he's covered both activities happening in Boston and nationally in the Encore movement. You can sometimes even request a meeting, as Ray Jetson did, when you're following a local publication or someone in your beat, and invite someone to have a coffee with you or meet you in person. So there's many, many ways to do it.
Yeah, and I would imagine there's a somewhat of a tipping point with that kind of thing, right? Is where you have to establish yourself as an expert in a particular area, and then the requests for interviews and being quoted start to kind of increase. That at first it's kind of hard to be like, I'm a thought leader in this space and get quoted, but I think over time you can expect that will happen more and more the more that you do it.
Yeah, I have two that I'm going to highlight here. So in response to my shouting out Mick Smyer, Mick wrote something that I just want to make sure because I think it's really important. Mick was especially prolific on the op-ed front. He just kept writing op-eds again and again once he mastered the format. And he parlayed that into a regular blog at Psychology Today. So he had this stack of examples of his op-eds that he was able to show when he pitched Psychology Today for a regular blog. And what it showed that editor is that he could produce regularly new ideas, fresh ideas, ideas that are linked to the news. And that's what a publication will want to know. If they're going to make a commitment to publishing you on a regular basis, they're going to want to know that you can see ideas in the world and turn them around quickly and make them relevant to the population that reads that publication. We did get a follow-up quote. Gordon asked, what's the format for citing someone? Says certain publications don't want footnotes. So speaking from someone who hasn't used a footnote, I don't know, since I was in college, that really intrigued me. So I think we live in a world of linking and not footnoting. When we're talking about popular media of the kind that we've really been focusing on here today, there is no footnote in newspapers or in op-eds or any of the kinds of publications we're talking about, except white papers, of course, would have footnotes. They usually go to endnotes at the end of a publication, but those are much more in the research vein. But usually for the kind of consumer-oriented publications we're talking about, the proper way to cite an authority is through a hyperlink, not through a footnote.
I want to take two, if that's okay, Marci, that are just short things. Joanne asked about Facebook and that it's a personal page. Is it okay, if I'm understanding this correctly, to kind of have that be used both personally and professionally? And I would just say yes. Across all social media platforms, I wouldn't worry about that too much. I forgot to mention on Twitter, but it's great to add views of my own to your profile. So that kind of gives you permission to be really authentic and to share your interests, whether they be personal or professional. I do think Facebook skews slightly more personal these days than Twitter is a more professional type of content. But I think that there's room to really have that bleed over, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. And then the other question I wanted to take, a few people have asked if there's resources or directories for information on websites where you can publish a written article or blogs that are looking for stories. The first one, I would say Medium and LinkedIn are the go-to places that you can use. There's really, in my mind, not a whole lot of a reason to use a different publishing platform. They're great. They're actually really similar. So if you know how to use one, you can easily use the other. And then the second one, the blogs, I think that's going to have to be a scrappier effort. I would just recommend doing Google searches based on your area of interest. So like, you know, you could do aging blogs, best blogs on ageism or age segregation or whatever your issue area is and see what comes up. But that one's probably going to require a little bit more of a scrappy approach.
All right, I'll go with, I see two that I can answer. One is how prolific or active do you have to be to see results from social media? And that's a really good question. We have some examples of people on our team who have very few followers, but have the right followers. And they don't post often, but they post strategically. And I think there's a way to think about your social media activity that is more strategic than overwhelming. And it's not so important to reach hundreds of people as it is to reach the right people and to get the right people looking at you. And there's a slow build to any social media activity. So at the beginning, you'll probably be reading more, observing more, following more people, building out your network, learning the kind of weird jargon and language that comes along with any of the social media platforms, and also learning how they work technologically. I think give yourself the chance to build slowly. I'll just give one example. I mean, Eunice Nichols on our team is a perfect example, and Phyllis Siegel is in this category too. We were at one staff retreat where a bunch of people wanted to learn Twitter, and we just paired up with people who are really good at Twitter who wanted to mentor someone who was new to Twitter. And within weeks, they both became kind of really hooked on it. And neither of them has hundreds of followers, but they, over time, built increasingly and influential people, like our funders, started noticing them, picking up and reposting, to the point where, I can't remember whose tweet it was, but Chelsea Clinton retweeted someone on our team who doesn't even have a lot of followers, because of some work we were doing with the Clinton Foundation initiative. And that was just our biggest social media score of the year. And it came from someone who really doesn't have a lot of Twitter experience or followers on Twitter. So you just never know what's going to happen. Relatedly, someone asked the question, is it worth investing in podcasts because they may be on their way out, or there's so many of them? And increasingly, I feel like podcasts to me have often can be very useful for people who want to go deep on something. And I've been very consumed by some limited edition or specialized podcasts that may never have thousands of listeners, but have, again, the right audience. So I'm pretty high on right now the Eisner, Trent Stam from the Eisner Foundation has a really good podcast called How We Run, and I'm hooked on it. And for anyone who wants to learn about the nonprofit sector, it's just a must listen. Now, it's getting traction, but it's an example of a podcast that, maybe it's never going to hit the top 10, but for the people who want that content, it's going to be really important, and it's evergreen, meaning it won't go out of date. It's relevant to anybody who wants to learn about the sector and get inside accounts from a head of a foundation who's willing to put his ideas out in the world. That's going to have value, even if it never rises to the top of the iTunes charts.
I would also say, you're reminding me, Marci, when I was writing for Forbes, I would profile social entrepreneurs. And I think podcasts are similar because they're usually interviews, that there's something really lovely about hitting pause on the self-promotion and focusing on somebody else doing really great things that you're inspired by. And indirectly, you're spreading the word about your work and who you are as a thought leader. So I think there's also, similar to what I said with Connie's story, like when you're of service to other people and lifting up their stories, and giving yourself the opportunity to get known in that kind of maybe more altruistic way, I think that's also something to consider, that it doesn't always have to be reiterating your talking points. It can be bringing visibility to other people that you're really interested in, and then that also builds your professional network and gives you access to people. I would reach out to people cold when I was writing for Forbes, and I never had anybody say no to an interview. People like to talk about themselves in general. So it's a great way to reach people as well, because access can be a challenge.
Great point, Sarah. I'm just doing a time check. I think Duncan may want to run a little poll if we can impose on you all for a little while. And in the meantime, we'll look to see if there's other questions we can close with.
And I also want to say that some of these questions, we'll look through this after the fact, assuming that's possible, Duncan. And we'll make sure that we can answer some of these questions in the follow-up communication as well. But thank you all for staying on. We didn't lose too many of you as the webinar progressed, so that's great news, and we hope this has been of value.
And we're referring to Duncan Magnuson, and I realize we've never introduced Duncan or asked him to show his face. So Duncan, if you feel like revealing yourself, I feel like our audience may want to see you and thank you also. So feel free to show yourself if you're game.
Sure. Hey there, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. This was a really productive meeting, and I hope you found it helpful.
I'll just take, I want to say, so Carrie Sweeney just asked about shorter podcasts. One of the things that I like most about Andy Levine's podcast is that the episodes are about 15 to 20 minutes. I live in Los Angeles, and I work from home, so I don't have a drive to listen to podcasts, and I have two small kids. So finding time to listen to 45-minute podcasts just does not happen in my life. But a 15 or 20-minute podcast is perfect because I can have my lunch, listen, and then get back to my work. So I think thinking about shorter format podcasts is a great idea.
Yes, I completely agree. As someone who can never get through all the podcasts in my queue, I'm right with you on that.
The LinkedIn guide, George, sure, we can follow up with Marci's, what she referenced where she's helping people on LinkedIn. Right, Marci? There's a link we can send.
Well, actually, I was referring to a class on Encore Careers I did on LinkedIn. So I don't have a guide, but I will send a link to that class. But if we can find a good guide on LinkedIn, we will share it because we've been getting a lot of questions about LinkedIn, and we're all using it a lot lately. And I would just say also, if anybody has any resources that you want to share, Duncan, what's the best way if other people want to contribute some resources to our follow-up? Can we keep the chat box open for a little while?
Sure, or you guys can email me too, because I'm going to be pulling this together with Duncan. So sgibson@encore.org. If you want to email me anything that you think would be valuable to the group, that'd be awesome.
I just put Sarah's email right in the chat, so if anybody wants to email with us more ideas, Sarah's the go-to on that. Yeah, and I would say also when you're writing to Sarah, if there's other areas where you would like a deeper dive, or if you think this would be a useful webinar for us to run periodically, we do want to hear from you because we're trying to figure out how to make this kind of learning regular and useful. So, Duncan, have we had enough time to run the poll?
Yep. Would you like to see the results?
Let's show it. I'm prepared.
Whoa.
Well, we don't know well, we had pretty good response rate. Okay. People feel more equipped to use their voice to advance ideas they're working on. But we can brag about this. I'm actually taking a screenshot right now, Sarah. I'm gonna brag about this on social media.
Well, and thanks. This was, as Marci said at the beginning, this was our first time doing something like this. So we appreciate you all letting us experiment, and we're really glad that you found it valuable.
And if you're on this webinar and we have shared your tips, I just want to give a real shout out to all the people who really helped us get prepared and share their expertise with us. It means a lot. All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your day, and we're signing off now.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.